Hello and welcome back to You're Better Than That, a podcast with me, Hannah Miller, and my friend Zoe Rossmodell. Hello.
Hello. Hello.
Today's episode is all in honour of International Women's Day, not to be confused with World Women's Day, which I've made up. International Women's Day. And we thought we'd have a bit of a chat about women in leadership, women in the world of work, what it feels like to consider some of the issues that are facing women today. And that's a massive topic, so we can't do it all. One of the things I wanted to mention as a bit of a guide for our conversation was this brilliant book called Lessons in Chemistry. I mentioned it in last week's episode, which was all about some favourite books of mine. Lessons in Chemistry is a fantastic novel. It's just a novel, but it looks at a wonderful life story of a woman called Elizabeth Zott, who is a scientist. She's a chemist in the 1960s. And so it covers lots of like deep themes around life and loss and all the usual meanderings of a book. But you've got this extra dimension that she is a woman in a field full of men. She's in science, she's in a STEM situation. And so she experiences some pretty awful gender discrimination. And I thought a really good place to start as we think about this is what it sometimes can feel like to be in a situation where you are in the minority. And women in certain fields are in the minority. Other protected characteristics are in the minority. And how does it feel to be in that space? And one of the things that I was wondering about when we think about this is this idea, let's get straight at it, a difficult one, okay? This idea of tokenism. So whereas in Elizabeth Zott's situation, it was, we don't even want you here. You're a woman. What do you even think you're doing? I think in many of our situations now, it isn't, we don't want you here. It's this worry in our heads or our thoughts of, am I only here because I'm a woman and you need some more women in this space? And I think that's really tricky. I think it's a tricky balance between recognising that maybe somebody's trying to do something really good to address an issue of imbalance, but how does it feel to be that person? Like, for example, I've been in some situations where through no fault of anybody else at all, this is really important to say, I've thought, am I being asked to do this because actually you haven't got a woman in this situation? I don't know whether you've ever felt like that, Zoe.
No, yeah, totally. And I think it can be applied to lots of different things within the space of diversity, so gender, age, skin colour, background. I think
you're a black woman for anybody who doesn't know you, so
yes.
Let's add that's two characteristics that you're aware of. How do you deal with it if you feel like, have you ever felt like, am I just being asked to be here for that reason? Have you ever had that thought, even if it's not true?
Yeah, I'd be lying if I said no. I think I come back to motive and understanding people's motives. Is it wrong for someone to want more diversity and select me to have a black woman in the space, or select you because you're a woman, or someone else because of whatever it is? I don't know, but I think it comes down to motive and the reasoning behind it. And is it a pure motive? That's the question I would have.
That's a really good thought.
Have you ever felt that for you?
Yeah, and I think your point there is a really good one. Is this person or this situation or this organisation trying to do something positive? Mm-hmm. And if their motivation is also around that idea of inclusivity and representation, maybe that is part of their selection criteria. And does that have to be a negative thing? And I think that's the point you're making. Maybe that is part of what they're thinking. Actually, we'd really like to have a female voice in this situation, or so on and so forth. If it feels like I'm ticking a box, that's very different, isn't it? To actually, we're trying to see things change. And before we started recording, we were just chatting about our own situations of recognising we've seen actually representation does make a difference. And I remember hearing a friend of mine who's a black woman say, actually, even if the only reason I'm there is a representation reason, I can use that situation for real good, because then I am representing and people see me, and then maybe attitudes change.
I think as well it's because I've been in places where people are selected for diversity for show and then not listened to. So I think if it's a team and they, for example, just this, using the example of women, and they want a woman on the team just to show, look, we've got a woman, but then internally aren't listening to her or aren't really valuing her voice or what she has to say, that's also a problem. So it's like, okay, yes, if I'm selected for that, great, but then you also have to listen to me and have diversity in input and not just on a picture or elsewhere, you know?
That's right, because otherwise you're not going to have the ramifications, the positive ones that you're looking for.
Yeah.
And actually, if you get that right and that person is listened to, that doesn't mean they get their own way all the time, but it means they're listened to, they are collaborated with. If we can get that right, so much is going to follow in the fact that we will maybe get rid of this thought in our head that I'm here as a token. Because if we get to a place where we're in more representative situations, I won't have to think like that. And I think an extra thought is when I'm having a thought like that, maybe it's like, I don't know, a cousin of imposter syndrome. And it's just giving me another reason why I shouldn't really be here. So maybe when I hear that voice of you're only here because you're a woman and they wouldn't be asking you otherwise, that is like a cousin of imposter syndrome, really. It's giving me a reason to self-select out or to underestimate myself, when actually all I can go on is the facts. And the facts are, I've been asked, I'm in this environment and I'm going to take my opportunity. And on that basis, how can I share that opportunity with other people? How can I make room for others and not feel like, therefore, this is my opportunity and there isn't room for anyone else? I mean, this is really complex and a big deal. But I think as we think about women in leadership, this is definitely an aspect to consider. We find ourselves in situations where shall I carry on? Sorry. This is an important topic. It's a big one and it's important to consider because we find ourselves in women in leadership. This is an aspect for so many people. Not every sector and not every industry, but lots of them. You can think, I'm the only woman in the room. And that kind of leads me on to thinking about power dynamics. And that is a big part of what goes on in this book, the experience of being in a position of less power. And I think if there are men listening to this men listening to this podcast, I would say that even the most open and generous and fantastic men that I know may not always realise the underlying power dynamic that's in play in relationships between men and women in the world of work or anywhere else. And I had a situation a while ago which was really difficult, and the power dynamic was really part of the reason why it was difficult for me. So as part of my work, I go and deliver talks. I deliver them to groups of business owners. It's really regular that I do that. I really enjoy that work. I go and talk to them about personality and how it impacts our leadership and the reason why we need diversity around the table in terms of personality, which actually is quite an interesting aspect of what we're talking about today. And so I went to do a piece of work that I regularly do. And in that room, as is often the case, were about 10 men. Okay, 10 men between the ages of 40 and 55, I guess. And that is very normal and something that I experience a lot. I turn up, I do my speaking engagement, and then I go home. On this particular day, it was a very unusual set of circumstances in that it just didn't go very well. It was not well received. And I don't mean that in a kind of big-headed way, but I've done this. It's not my first rodeo. I've done it lots of times and it's well received. And this particular group of people had a character in it. They had a man in the group, a leader, who had a lot of influence in the room. He was not the chair. He was not in charge. And yet he behaved as if he was. He set the tone. And what I noticed was that he went first when people were asked to give feedback and reflections. And he gave such weighty, negative feedback that he impacted the way everybody else in the room behaved. So it was like a little micro lesson in group dynamics, actually. Added into the fact that he was being negative, the people that followed, who clearly valued his opinion, kind of mirrored what he said. Maybe not as harshly as he said, but they didn't push against it. The chair didn't say, hang on a moment. They didn't, there was nothing to kind of push back on this environment. And I became very aware of feeling quite vulnerable in that moment. And I actually became aware of gender in a way that I don't normally. I wouldn't say that I particularly think about that in those situations, but I felt separate, I felt different, and I felt that people were not aware of what it felt like to be the only female in that space and what it felt like to be in that position. And so in the break time, they didn't really speak to me. They were rude, they were dismissive, and they were trying to kind of hijack what we were doing. I'm quite an emotional person, and when you're in a situation like that, empathy is not your friend. Emotion is not your friend. And I had to work very, very hard to keep my emotions in check and to not take it personally. And I think that's something I want to say here, is that it was rude, but it wasn't personal because I hadn't done anything wrong. And I had to keep saying to myself, you'll be done in an hour. Bring your best, do your best. Don't, when they go low, we go high, which is something I really try to live by. Do as best a job as you can. Be as generous as you can with your words and the way you do things, and then leave. And then kind of, wipe the dust kind of thing off your feet and go. And I think as I was driving home, it was about 2.5 hours away, I just was reflecting on both the poor behaviour, but also the way I suddenly became aware of, I have no agency here, or I felt like I had no agency here, and you are unaware of how your words and your behaviour together are making me feel, and the gender aspect added in. So I think what I would say there is it makes me reflect on any situation where somebody's in the minority, whatever the reason they're in the minority, whether that's because of the colour of their skin, because of their gender, because of their nationality, because of their age. And we need to be aware of what we have around us, and that we have our eyes open to how that person might be feeling. And that could work out the other way around, with a male speaker in a group full of women. How are we behaving that's inclusive, that doesn't feel like we've just kind of banded together?
Yeah. And I also think it's not necessarily inclusive with things that you can see. I think something I reflect on often is even as a black woman, it's not just about getting a black woman. It's there's so much nuance to it. Like, there's so much diversity in thinking, and in the way I was raised would be completely different to someone else. And so I love what you're saying. It's so true. And also being mindful that it's not just what you see, it's also being aware that thinking is a massive part of it, and diversity in thinking is a massive piece to the puzzle.
That's right. And that's one of the things that I try to talk to leaders about. So in a more general sense, one of the key things that I do is help leaders and teams think about, we need diversity of approach. Yeah. And the tool that you and I know and we know and love is around, it used to be called Strengths Finder, it's now called Clifton Strengths, and that is a very good demonstration of the fact that you could put 5 women in a line and 5 men in a line, and the way they think, the way they behave, the way they lead, the way they get things done is wildly different from one another, let alone their heritage, let alone nature, let alone nurture. They are going to approach the same problem or situation very, very differently. And the best teams, over and over and over again, the feedback is that the best teams have diversity of approach. So when we can have that difference of a perspective, of age, experience, background, as a social background, which we haven't even mentioned, if we can get as much of that alongside people whose personality is different, I'm not going to say that it's not challenging, because that is challenging, but it's also going to give really brilliant outcomes in a way that we wouldn't have if we just have repetition and repetition, which is why I guess on a bigger level, we need representation in all spheres. We need people from different backgrounds in our politics, in our positions of leadership, so that we are really well represented. And this is just one part of that.
Which woman outside of your family would you say really inspires you at this point in time?
Ooh, that's a big question. A regular person or somebody that people will know?
Can be anybody.
Okay. And you don't mind if they're... Okay. That's such a big and good question. So I think there's a principle around one person that immediately comes to mind. I'm going to say a couple, but one who comes to mind that people are going to know is Michelle Obama, and particularly the specific aspect of how she handles criticism, how she handles the way people might behave towards her. So you can agree or disagree with her political stance on anything you want to, but she has always held her head high, and she has always chosen to live according to her values, regardless of how she's treated, even in some really, really unkind, cruel situations. She has chosen to rise above. And I really admire that. I admire people that where you could give as good as you've got, people choose not to do that. And I think that the outcome for people like that is so much better for their life, for their health, for their soul, for their mind, because they've chosen not to do that. And so I admire her for that reason. She's somebody that I look on and think, you are strong, and you have proven your strength all the way through your life, but there is a desire to, I am not going to stoop to a behaviour that is not befitting of who I am. And that really, really impresses me. And then I think there are lots of like female friends I've got that, as a bunch, I think I would say I admire their choice to be vulnerable as a friend, and their choice to engage fully with what it is to choose female friendship really fully. I've got some amazing friends, and they are honest about the good stuff in their life. They are honest about the really painful things they're experiencing, and they cheer me on and others on. There is this kind of allyship of we will support one another, which sounds so cheesy, but I can't tell you how much it means when somebody is willing to like root for you, to cheer for you. I saw something the other day where I saw somebody we both know called Mads speaking publicly, and it was her first time of ever doing it. And from where I was sitting, you could see her three really good friends who were front row watching, and they were just fully, there was nothing in them other than absolute encouragement for her. Their faces were smiling at her, they were cheering her on, they wanted her to absolutely smash it. And just being able to like watch on at that just filled my heart with like this lovely feeling of what a lovely thing to watch, that there is room for all of us to do well. I'm not sure I always grew up with that, so I think for me that's a change.
There's a lot of talk about, and it is true, about how women and girls tear each other down, and there's a lot of competition between women, but actually the thing that comes against that is celebration and celebrating each other, even if someone's in the same space as you. I think that's really key. It's easy to celebrate someone who's distant from you in terms of what they're doing, but when someone's in the same job or doing the same thing, going after the same thing, I think that's a test of, are we truly celebrating?
Completely agree. And if I'm honest, I don't think I grew up recognising that as much as maybe your generation does. And I think I probably have believed many times that there isn't room for us both. That's definitely something I would have felt, that if you're doing that, then I can't too. If that happens for you, it's not going to be able to happen for me. And I think that's been a shift I've tried to grow in, where I realise actually there is room. There's room for you to do really well, and me, and in the same space. And I think I've got friends who are way further down the line than me in this space. And instead of thinking I can never compete with that, or I'm never going to do as well, a better phrase for me to think of is, look, if they can do that, then maybe I can learn, and maybe I can, maybe there's room for me too, and maybe I can too. And there isn't a comparison, is there? And there is no competition, because we can only occupy our space anyway. I can only do the thing that I can do. And I think for me, that has been a really helpful point. But I guess as we're talking about women today, I think the better we can do around actually meaningfully wanting other people to do well, whoever they are, is again a really, really good principle. Encouraging people, being their best and first champion, even when it might even cost a little bit, is a really good principle.
And I do think there's a point, even if it is hard, the more you do it, the more genuine it becomes. Like, I've even seen in my own life, the more I'm like, okay, this is hard for me, but I'm going to choose celebration and collaboration over competition, and like training myself to do that to the point where now it's second nature, and I'm like kind of, I don't know what the word is, but like just training myself, my mind, to be in that mindset. And then you get to a place where you're like, oh, I genuinely feel joy to see people win in the same space as me as well.
And I think what you've just said there is that it starts as a choice. I sometimes we think that our behaviour should just be magically really nice and we would choose that by nature, but actually we've got to choose. And when you're faced with that feeling of, oh, look what they're doing and I would have liked to have done that, which I can't pretend I don't feel. I have it regularly. I have a choice to make in that moment. Am I going to soothe those feelings and let them grow? Or do I go, gosh, look at this. This is fantastic. I am so pleased for them. Look at what they've been able to do. And I think we need mentors, we need allies, we need people in our lives that are going to act in that role. There's people I need to be doing that for and people who can do it for me. And I also just want to say that I don't think it's an age-related thing either. There are some, what I didn't say when we were talking about women in my life, there are a few younger women in my life in their 20s who I am regularly challenged by in terms of their courage, their wisdom, their outlook on life. So I don't just think it's a case of I've got things to pass on to them, which I have, and I know I have, but it's just so reciprocal. There's such a lot of reciprocity that when the more time I spend, the more I'm like, I'm so impressed by this. And look at the baggage you don't have that I had at that age. I was talking to my chiropractor about body baggage and feeling, how we feel about our body. And I know that hasn't gone away. And I know actually in many ways it's still an incredibly hard environment for women around what we look like. But I actually think I know more women who are younger who are more comfortable with who they are than my generation. So I think that's something to be really pleased that we're making a bit of progress, for sure. So a couple of other things I just wanted to mention really around women, and maybe one of the last, I think there's a whole episode we can do on imposter syndrome, so I don't want to go into it too much. But as it is International Women's Day, I think I want to say that imposter syndrome affects not just women, although it's something that women have talked about more. There was a really famous book that came out many years ago called The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women, and it's just been reprinted as The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women and Men, because there's a realisation that so many of us aren't sure whether we should be doing what we're doing, whether we're capable of doing what we're doing, whether we have the capacity to do what we're doing, and is somebody just going to find us out? And that this is not a female-only issue. And it's something that affects between 70 and 80% of the human race, we think, actually, at different times. So I guess all I want to say, without going into this in huge detail, is that we need to recognise it may represent itself in different ways, but that feeling of not having everything that we need is more universal than we might think, and that everybody needs encouragement, even if they may be presenting in a way that they don't. Most people don't think they've got it together. Most people are worried that somebody's going to find them out. Most people think that they're going to make a mistake, or that they're not good enough, or that they don't have the accolade that they need. Whenever you're doing something that's new and involves a bit of bravery, why are you going to feel like you've got everything in line? And so I think I just wanted to kind of round up today's episode by saying, if you are listening to this episode and you feel that you are inadequate or somewhere beyond your station, lots of us are feeling like that. And that voice isn't true. It might be a real voice in your head, but it's not true. That's the actual imposter, not you. You are not an imposter because you are being you. And anything that's a bit uncomfortable is because we're learning. And if we don't feel uncomfortable, maybe we're not learning anymore. So be encouraged by that. We need women in every space. We need men in every space. And by the way, that is something I feel I'm a mother of 3 sons, and the future is not just female. The future is only positive if we can work together and we can collaborate and complement one another. There is space for us all, and we've got to get past this conversation to a place where we're just inclusive and accepting, and recognise that we bring different things to the table, to the party, and we need each of us there to bring our very own gifts and talents. Happy International Women's Day, everybody.